if you're a beginner gardener, it can be incredibly overwhelming because there's so much information out there on what to do. So here are 3 of my tips when it comes to gardening from someone who's gardened pretty much their entire life. Tip number 1 is not that obvious, and it's that what works for me may not work for you. What I show, what Kevin shows, what Charles Downing shows, all works differently. I personally find that my front yard is a different gardening climate than even my backyard. So the tips and tricks that I sometimes show for warmer soils or different forms of soils in my front yard will be different tips than I will actually give in the back. So be your own garden scientist and actually experiment and find a solution that works for you. Don't get dogmatic and locked into one way of gardening and then be overwhelmed when it does not succeed. It sounds bizarre, I know, but for example, a Charles Downing no-dig garden may not work for you if you have a very heavy clay compacted soil and you just throw a garden on top. This is actually because that compaction can cause a layer that ends up in a perched water table and it causes root rot, you name it. So don't lock into it. It may not work. Don't get invested in it and try different things. My next tip is actually that what worked last year may not work this year. Seriously, it sounds bizarre, but it is very true. And it took me a little while to actually realize that this was the case. One great example of this is tomatoes. Some years tomatoes perform very well, and other years they don't, and it can be caused by heat, humidity, you name it. Another one is root vegetables or potatoes. Some years they do great, and some years they do poorly, again, depending on the climate for that summer. So don't get too hung up when something doesn't work that first year, because there's a high likelihood that it's going to work in the years to come. This is why when you do garden, you try to preserve as much as possible. You don't know if next year's harvest is going to take you throughout the entire winter. Now, there's ways to manage this or mitigate this, such as shade cloths or bug nets or different forms of pest management if that's the issue that's running rampant in the garden that year. But again, regardless of your best efforts, you're just going to have some years that plants just don't perform as well. Next one. This one's also another bizarre one. Don't trust your zone. Seriously though, your zone isn't what matters. What matters is your last frost date. So many of you have probably noted my garden is nowhere near to even being planted. That's because my last frost date is actually June 10th. Yes, June 10th. Now, I do put stuff out before the last frost date, and I am starting to put stuff outdoors now because my soil temps are yielding it. But I need to be careful and I need to make sure things are covered. So what that means for you is when you're starting seeds, what matters is your last frost date. When transplanting, what matters is your last frost date. The only time zones are really relevant to you is actually when you're selecting perennials to stay in your garden long term. Then you do want to get in your zone or lower because those plants tend not to survive your winter. So your zone, within a zone, there can be a wide range of last frost dates. So my zone 3 can be anywhere from May 25th, depending on where you are, all the way till June 10th. Again, depending on where you are. So if you say zone 3, it's not a direct communication for when your last frost date is. So last frost date is actually the most important part. Okay, this next tip is going to confuse some of you, but it's actually expect really bad harvest for the first 3 years. Seriously, it takes about that long, I find, until just the soil in general is able to be profitable, I guess you could say, when it comes to harvest and just plant health. I'm always expanding my garden all the time. That means I'm always putting new beds in, and last year I think I put in about 3. My expectations of those beds was poor because I know from the past when I first get a bed established, it just tends to perform poorly. So don't stress out if your first 3 years don't look too great. Make sure you plant them and get things rolling. But after that time, that's when you can start questioning your gardening methods or what you're doing and get a little bit clearer view when it comes to that. You're probably thinking, well, why would that be? And there's a number of different reasons for this. Some cases we use straight compost, which can cause some problems and actually make gardening a little bit more difficult for some folks. And then we also have lack of compaction or proper soil porosity for those plant roots, which also can cause issues. And then just in general, we don't have the microbes that are relevant to plant roots, and we don't have, the root channeling. We actually don't even have the macrofauna in a lot of cases established in an area where we're just starting out of bed. So that kind of explains why we see this, and that's why you should not stress it for at least 3 years. So continue to garden, continue to plant, expect less than stellar results until that 3-year mark. Now, if you're doing a perennial bed, for example, I actually would wait until about 5 years before you really see explosive growth. So plant your perennials based on the spacing that they require, because that's very important in that, but don't expect it to look full or flush until about that 5-year mark. Gardening is a long game, whether it's soil health, perennial beds, or just even annual structures such as trellising, etc. and so forth. I've been gardening in this same property for 10 years alone, and I'm still expanding. So don't get your sights set on getting it all done in 1 year. Take your time with it. It's a hobby. It's a lifestyle. You won't get it all done in 1 year. Okay, last tip, and probably the most important tip, is don't go over the top with garden projects. Seriously. Behind me here is 2 sets of compost, and I just recently set these composts up. It's because before I was doing a lot of garden projects and I wasn't spending much time focusing or zoning in on just perfecting one thing. And because my first year when I moved into this house, I thought, I already know how to garden, I'm just going to load this place up. I ended up becoming very overwhelmed. So little projects one at a time. Start with a single bed or a couple beds, and then add the compost the next year. Don't do everything at once. If it's perennials, go with perennials that year, go with annuals the next. Take your time in discovering what your yard's personality is, because yes, your yard has a personality, trust me. It's a personality in the front yard, it's a personality in the backyard, and you need to figure out what that is and be able to work with it. But if you're a beginner gardener, you can do this. I promise you can. There's a ton of great resources out there to help you with this. Some people say I'm one. Some people disagree that I'm one, but go find what works for you. And again, don't get dogmatic. Keep your eyes open to the various different ways to garden and figure out what works best for you. For me personally, I like doing peppers in containers because that's what works best rather than in ground. I like my tomatoes in raised beds rather than in ground. I like my root vegetables in the ground rather than raised beds. And these are all just my preferences that I've developed over time, not because I listened to someone, but because I was my own garden scientist. So there is a message here. Be your own garden scientist. It's incredibly important as a beginner gardener and even as an expert. So I'll talk to you next time. Bye.